Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to Wildcard Wednesday. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ben Pulowski. I'm part of GeoTab's Learning Center. Today is the day that many of you have been waiting for, where we are going to take a look at the ELD mandate in Canada, what you need to know, and how to prepare. So we have Kyle Dodsworth, our ELD regulations specialist. Kyle, thanks for joining us today. Take it away.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for jumping in with us and talking about ELD for the next hour or less. So we are going to talk about the new Canadian ELD mandate that was announced about a week and a half ago. I will preface this though that it's still relatively new, so there's definitely questions that everyone will have. There's questions that we have as a vendor, so we'll try to answer everything as best as we know. But being that it is something that is brand new, there are going to be gaps in our knowledge, and we're going to have to wait for some more information from Transport Canada to answer everything that we're thinking about. So let's jump in. What we want to talk about is the background and the timelines around this new announcement. Then we'll talk a little bit about the differences between the US ELD mandate and the Canadian one. Then talk a little bit about how to prepare for that Canada mandate when it becomes the full law. And I've also included a huge amount of resource and links to resources for you if you want to go and read through things on your own. I definitely would suggest that you jump in and read along some of the announcements that Transport Canada has announced. The actual law itself is actually not even that big. It's certainly smaller than the USA version. So if you want to sit down on a cloudy day and read for a little bit, there's links at the end of this as well. And it's all public information. We, as an ELD carrier vendor, we don't have anything extra, so we don't know more or less than what's out there yet. So first, a little bit about the background and the timelines for the Canadian ELD mandate. So the general background is that in Canada, there's about 150,000 commercial vehicles that would need an ELD. What the Transport Canada has done is kind of projected out how many more vehicles will be around in the next 10 years or so. Well, 10 years from when they first started this journey. So in 2028, they're anticipating that there's going to be 50,000 more, so a 25% increase. Now, about half of the current vehicles that are in Canada right now travel to the US. So they already have ELDs for the US because of the USA mandate. Their goals was first and foremost the same as the US ELD mandate, so safety and fatigue. From Transport Canada's numbers, about 25% of convictions for commercial vehicles are due to running over the hours of service limits. And drivers that have hours of service violations for those limits are over 2 times more likely to actually have an accident. So that is the primary goal, is to increase safety and to decrease fatigue of these drivers on the road. Now, another piece that they looked at was unfair competition. Basically, they wanted to make sure that everyone follows the regulations. So everyone follows the hours of service regulations. That way, you don't have a company who is skirting those regulations and maybe driving more or getting more work time compared to others that were following the law. Harmonization is another big piece, trying to get all of the provinces to align with the federal rules as much as possible. That's happened already with the normal hours of service rules. A lot of provinces are almost identical to the federal rules, but there are a few provinces in Canada that have completely different hours of service rules compared to the federal. And then lastly was efficiency. So saving time and money using the ELD versus an electronic or electronic device or electronic recording device or ERD or paper. That's another piece, is that the ELD can save you time by doing a lot of the inputs for you automatically. And that's something we've actually seen in the USA. So those 4 goals are sort of the 4 main things that is mentioned in the background of the ELD mandate. Now, for some timelines, a day before the USA mandate first kicked in 2017, the Government of Canada published the proposed regulations to amend the commercial vehicle drivers' hours of service regulations. And that was published in Canada Gazette Part 1, so that's December 16th. So it kind of laid out a bit of a framework and kicked off the comment period for Canada ELD. So 2 years passed, and almost 2 years passed, and we hadn't heard much until June 13th, where it appeared in the Canada Gazette 2 And so that became the final version, and it is mandating the use of ELDs for commercial trucks and bus operators. It wasn't really a huge surprise. Obviously, we knew that the mandate was coming. Now, inside of that, it's actually not going to be until 2021 where you'll actually need to use an ELD. That is the drop deadline. So it's a 2-year rollout from June 2019 when it appeared in Canada Gazette 2 to June 2021 where you have the actual enforcement deadline. So between now and then, you can still do everything that you are currently doing. There's also no notice yet about any kind of soft rollout. So we are not sure how soon you can start using an ELD in Canada. In the US, there was sort of a soft rollout, and in 2016, you can actually start using ELDs if you had them. We don't have anything like that in Canada yet. So for right now, it should be business as usual for everybody. Now, I'm going through the technical specifications for the USA versus Canada. The technical specifications, they're actually linked at the end of this presentation. They're from the CCMTA, and the most recent version is from April. We're anticipating that that is going to be the final version, but hopefully we don't have a lot of changes between now and 2021. But some of the similarities between the two, when you start reading through the laws, you start seeing a lot of things coming out from the Canadian mandate that are actually identical to the US. In some cases, the actual wording is the exact same, almost like they've copied and pasted from the US ELD law. So just like in the US, the Canadian ELD is going to sync with the engine. So it's going to connect into the engine in some way. It's going to create automatic drive logs and automatic on logs the exact same way it does in the US. So the exact same speed, so 5 miles an hour or 8 kilometers an hour. And then if you stop for 5 minutes, it's going to create that on log automatic. That's the exact same. Unassigned driving is also the exact same. So if the vehicle's moving around and it doesn't know who is actually driving, it's going to create unassigned logs, and you need to move those over to a driver or annotate them just like you do for the US mandate. If you have other people other than the driver editing logs, the editing process and the workflow is the exact same as well. And just like in the US, you can't edit drive logs either. So once a drive log is assigned automatically to a driver, can't be shortened, and you can't move it around, with one exception that I'll talk about later. Special driving statuses are there as well, just like in the US. So yard move finally makes an appearance in an actual law in Canada on paper. Personal use has always been inside of the standard law for Canada, but yard move wasn't. So it's nice to see yard move included, so it harmonizes with the US. And just like in the US, we're talking about model year 2000 or higher. So if you're driving an older vehicle, again, just like in the US, we harmonize there, so you don't have to worry about ELD if you're driving something that's older than 2000. That's pretty much a high level, and I think a lot of people would have anticipated that all of these were identical to harmonize between the US and Canada. The differences, though, so the differences are interesting. It does look like the Canadian mandate has learned a little bit from the US mandate and allowed for some differences to make life a little bit easier. So one of the big ones is right inside of the law, there's an exemption for rental trucks if you use them for 30 days or less. So the US had an amendment, and they had this 30-day or less exemption for about a year, but it expired and wasn't renewed. So this is actually not possible in Canada, because in Canada it's baked right inside of the law that if it's a rental truck, you don't need to worry about ELD unless it's over 30 days. Another big difference, and this is talking about that unassigned driving asterisk from the last slide, is if you have a driver who assigns themselves unassigned driving during the login process, or however your ELD supports it, if they assign themselves unassigned driving, but then realize it wasn't theirs, so they've made an error, you can actually move it back into the unassigned driving pile and have a different driver pick it up. So that's completely different than the US law. In the US law, if a driver picks it up, they are stuck with it, and if you have to do anything with it, the only option is annotating. Sounds like the Canadian group that wrote these regulations kind of learned from that a little bit. So you have a bit of leeway for unassigned driving that's picked up by the wrong driver. You can move it to make sure it goes to the right driver. Another little piece is that personal use, because the Canadian law says you can't use personal use more than 75 kilometers a day, in your ELD, it has to gray out that option if the driver's used 75 kilometers in that day already. So that's something that is completely different than the US, because as we know, the US doesn't have any kind of limitation in terms of the amount of personal use that you can use. Canada also has personal use restrictions as to when you can use it, and they're completely different than the US, including the 75 km a day piece. So you'll have to make sure that your ELD turns that option off based on its use of 75 kilometers. Another interesting part about the Canadian ELD is that it specifically says that it has to be able to warn drivers when they're running out of time. So this is a piece that's sort of interesting, that the US law, if you're not aware, doesn't actually have any kind of rule set requirement. It doesn't have to tell you anything about how many hours you have driven in a cycle or in the day. It doesn't have to warn you. Rule sets are something that ELD providers have put in because they're really great features. It looks like the Canadian group has kind of picked up on that and said, hey, if we're going to do this to try to help drivers, let's make sure that it's a requirement that the ELD tells drivers when they're running out of time. That means that your ELD has to support the Canadian hours of service regulations as a rule set. Now, this is not a problem for Geotab whatsoever, because we've put a lot of effort into our rule set in Canada in the last few months, and we support it entirely, all the way down to exemptions like the deferral of off duty, the 24 hours off every 7 days piece, which is a very small part of the law, but we still support. It's really important that your ELD has all of that inside of its rule set engine and it works correctly. The Canadian law is more complicated than the US, so make sure that that your ELD includes this, because it is part of the law. It has to warn a driver within 30 minutes of running out of any of the time on their calculations. So that's kind of a nice thing to see inside of the Canadian piece. One of the other big changes, the last two here are the big ones. The first big change is the way that the roadside transfer is going to work. So unlike the US, Transport Canada is not going to have an electronic repository where we can send transfer files. So in the US, the FMCSA has developed a program called ERODS, which is the Electronic Record of Duty Status System, and you send your logs via a fancy file into that system electronically when you press a button in your ELD for the US. In Canada, it's similar, but different. We're not going to have a web service or a pre-built button like we do in the US version. We're going to have an email address field where you put in the actual officer's email address, and when you email, it's going to send a data package, and inside of that data package, there's going to be two files. One's going to be a PDF file, which is kind of similar to how our compliance print works. And there's also going to have a CSV file that the officer can then put into a special program that Transport Canada is going to build, and then they can view the logs that way. So it's going to kind of be both at once. It's gonna have that file if they want to use this program, but it's also just going to have a PDF. So that's a big difference between the US and Canada. So same information inside of these packages in both sides of the border, but a different way to move them around. So that's going to be a big difference. And lastly, the biggest difference, and one that we heard about a year ago as a rumor, is ELDs in Canada they're not going to be self-certified. So Transport Canada is actually going to accreditate third-party, and we're not sure yet if it's going to be just people, organizations, companies, part of the government, but they'll be accredited third-party certification bodies, which will be responsible for certifying an ELD to meet the technical specs in Canada. So that is the biggest difference, and that's probably coming directly off of the USA's self-certification and some of the issues or troubles that we've had with companies that are not following the rules at all. Some companies have been pulled off of the certification list in the FMCSA, so this is probably a way to kind of help that from happening. So there are some frequently asked questions that we've been getting. As soon as this dropped in Canada Gazette 2, our team was flooded with a lot of questions, and the top 3 of them are on the next slide here. So 1, will Geotab be certified? And yes, of course, we do plan on certifying when the time comes, when we can. We've put in a lot of the groundwork kind of anticipating this ELD mandate, so we don't have a lot of work to do to be certified. But when will we be certified? We don't know. Inside of the background of this particular amendment is a little piece where Transport Canada does not anticipate the availability of accredited certification entities and the certification to be available any faster than 12 months from now. So we basically have to wait until there are accreditation bodies available for us to approach. And there's not really any information beyond that. There's information in the law about how to become one of these certification bodies, but no details for carriers as to what the process will be, how many of these bodies will there be, and like I said, will it be a different department of the government? Will it be a company? Can a carrier become a certification body as well as an ELD provider? We don't know. So we don't have an idea yet, but the best number we have is sometime 12 months from now. So that begs the question, what the heck do you do for your logs between now and 2021? Well, just continue doing what you're doing now. So if you're currently using an ELD, and in Canada it counts as an electronic recording device, and in the US it's the ELD, just keep doing that. That's what our solution is. If you're on paper now, you can still stay on paper for Canada. There's business as usual. This law didn't change anything nominally for any of the current HOS regulations. What it did do is it changed the current regulations for 2021. So you don't have to worry about doing anything new between now and then. Of course, if we get some more news from Transport Canada that says, hey, we're ready to go with the ELDs, if anyone wants to start using ELDs and it's 2020 sometime, we'll obviously let everybody know. But for now, it doesn't sound like you have to rush into it, and we don't actually know if you should rush into it because we don't know if there's a soft implementation, and 2021 in June is the deadline. So what should you do to prepare for this ELD? Well, like I said, first off, just continue to log as you do now. This announcement doesn't change anything in that current process. But there's definitely ELD vendors that are out there, similar to Geotab, that are obviously working in Canada. So if you are currently using paper, or if you're currently using an electronic recording device and you're looking for ELD partners, make sure that they're planning on doing the self-certification when the time comes. See if that company will guarantee that they're going to go through the certification process. Another big piece is make sure that they support all of the elements of the Canadian rule sets that the law requires. So those are all those little things like deferral of off-duty rules, 24 hours off every 7 days, the work day and the work shift calculations. It's much more complicated than the US rules, and you have to pick an ELD that supports it all. On a note about that off-duty rule piece, that deferral of off-duty piece, not a lot of people use it, but your ELD still needs to support it. There's actually a section inside of the transfer file that we're going to have to send over that requires a log of deferral of off-duty. If that piece is missing, there's a chance that the officer may not think you're using an ELD that's correct. And it's also going to be something that the certification bodies, I'm positive, will look for as well. So just because you don't need a particular part of the rule set or don't need a particular part of the ELD, make sure that the vendor still has that as part of their solution. Very important to make sure that it meets all the technical specifications, even if it's a part of the system you're not going to use. A lot of these things are unique to Canada. For instance, the deferral of off-duty rules doesn't exist in the US. So make sure that if it's a US-based ELD vendor, that they're familiar with how Canada works and the different pieces that are unique in terms of the rule set and in terms of these specifications. There are a few other technical pieces, and we don't have time to get into them, but there's a few technical pieces that are vastly different with how the back end works between a US ELD and Canadian ELD. So you really have to make sure that that US vendor is prepared to go through and change their technical specifications and their back end for some of these things. So you may want to just have a good conversation with them. Now, our blog is going to be a good place to get updates, because as we get more information, we'll continue to update our Canada blog. And as like I said earlier, if you're interested in this and you want to get a better look, go and look through the actual documentation from Transport Canada and the CCMTA. It's all public information. It's written in fairly straight English, which is nice. Obviously, I've read both the US and the Canadian laws, and I find the Canadian laws a little bit easier to read. They're also much shorter, so it's not a whole ton to digest. It's not 600 pages like it is in the US. It's maybe 100 or so. So jump in and read it over just to give yourself kind of a good baseline of what the changes are, and that's probably the best thing to do between now and the next time we get an update from Transport Canada. So on the end of this slide deck that Ben mentioned that everyone will be able to get, I've got links to the actual announcement. So Canada Gazette 1 from 2017, the Canada Gazette 2 from last month, the current Canada Hours of Service regulations. So SOR 2005-313 is the current batch of regulations. What the announcement in Canada Gazette 2 does is modify the elements of SOR 2005-313 and convert it into a new law, which is 2019-657, I think, off the top of my head, or 635, one of the two. So the current regulations are still in force all the way until 2021. So all the changes that you see inside of the Canada Gazette 2 announcement don't take effect until 2021, barring maybe 4 or 5 points, but they're all just grammatical changes that they fix at the same time. So the bulk of the changes aren't happening until 2021. The CCMTA technical specifications, so that is where you can go to look at the actual technical parts of all the things the ELD has to do, all the different types of data that it captures, information about the edits and the malfunctions and things like that. And then lastly, that link for the Geotab blog goes to our Canada ELD blog, and what we'll likely do is we will refresh that and add to it as we get more information from either the CCMTA or Transport Canada. So that's a good thing to check. And also the rest of the blog is obviously a great resource for everything else Geotab as well. All right, so that's it for what I had prepped. Gonna guess there's probably a bunch of questions, Ben, that if you've got anything good, let's discuss.
Yeah, so we have had some questions come through here. First one, are there any plans for a ferry exemption button?
There are plans for exemptions across. There's a bunch of other ones for Canada for provincial as well. So yes, there are still things we want to add into the Canadian rule set. I don't have timelines, however, on exactly what to put down here since there's a lot of them. But yes, there are plans, but no timelines yet.
Will those of us currently using e-logs be able to transfer data before 2021?
Not through the Geotab system until the actual feature is enabled. So will the ability to transfer logs to an officer exist beforehand? Well, yes, because we know that some AOBRD systems support that, and you can email logs through them to an officer. It's just a PDF and there's no real format to them. So that's kind of a two-part question, and I'm not sure if it was directed directly to Geotab or just in general. But we don't know when the actual ELD version is going to be available. There is a specific file transfer that has to go over. There's a specific answer that you're supposed to get when you send out your email to the officer. It's supposed to automatically send back a little template. And we don't know when that program to decipher the CSV file is going to be available. So it's a bit of an unknown right now, but for Geotab, we're going to wait for more information from Transport Canada in terms of the accreditation and that process before going down that path. We're also slightly concerned that the CCMTA may change technical specifications because the technical specifications aren't referenced directly in the law, so they didn't lock down the technical specs yet based on the law, and we're kind of waiting for that before going way down in the rabbit hole on that feature. But as soon as we get more information, we'll let everyone know, from our side specifically at least.
Is there any word on if companies are going to have to run an e-log if they stay within 160 kilometers of their home terminal?
There's still, yeah, you still have your exemptions as usual. There's nothing new in the announcement from Canada Gazette 2 that changes that, because if you're exempt from hours of service logs now, you'd be exempt from using an ELD. So that doesn't actually change.
Okay. The new regulation speaks about mounting the tablet or phone when running the e-log. Do you have any additional information on that?
No, but I'm gonna have to assume it's the same as the US. So the US kind of has that same provision. Now the US does have a federal law against using your phone while you drive. It also has a federal law about where you can mount it. Not sure if there's I don't think there's anything federally like that in Canada, so you would defer to the provincial pieces on that. So for instance, if there's a province that says that you can't have something stuck to the windshield, then you'd have to mount it on the dash. If there's a province that says that it has to be a certain part of the dash, go for it. The only part in the Canadian law is actually it's very similar to what the US law. It says that it just needs to be visible when you're seated in the driver position. It doesn't go into any more detail than that, so you'd have to defer to your provincial law about the rest of the mounting piece.
If we are a Canadian fleet, but we cross the border on a daily basis, do we switch between rule sets or do we leave it under a specific one?
That's up to you, depending on which way you want to go. The Canadian rule set does allow more driving and work time than the US, so I would obviously recommend that you do switch into something that reflects the US law. But there's actually, and there isn't an FAQ, well, there is an FAQ, but it's very slim for Canada. In the FMCSA FAQ, there's a whole section devoted just to cross-border about what happens on which side of the border you start on, and they even talk about Mexico to US and also Canada US. So I'd probably look at the FMCSA regulations first and then wait to see if there's anything extra added on by the Canadian FAQ. But that FMCSA FAQ is really good for cross-border from the FMCSA's perspective. And since they're more strict than the Canadian, if you follow that, you'd be in good shape. But any questions beyond that, check with the FMCSA field office in the state that you cross into, and then the Transport Canada CCMTA info that is in those links that I have on the previous slide. Reach out to them for more information since it is a legal opinion.
The Gazette Part 1 draft made some references to privacy requirements for trip history while a driver was under personal conveyance. Do you know if this made it into the final law?
Not the law, but it may be part of the specifications for the Canadian ELD personal use, because I believe it's identical to what it has in the US law, because the US law has the same, that when you're on personal use, the accuracy gets reduced by a power of 10. Something similar, I believe, is inside of the technical specifications for the Canadian as well. So the law doesn't reference it, but I believe the technical specifications from the CCMTA references something similar.
Do you know anything about the gross vehicle weights that require ELD? Are they the same as the US?
No, I don't believe they're the same as the US, but they are listed inside of the actual law. So inside of SOR 313, you can go check out exactly what the requirements are for what's a commercial vehicle and that type of thing.
Okay. And then we have a question here. So right now there's two Canadian rule sets available and you have to have feature preview enabled. Actually, I think it's out of feature preview, but regardless, there's only two Canadian rule sets. Are there going to be any other specific Canadian rule sets or exemptions added to GeoTab Drive soon while we're sort of waiting on everything else to be finalized? What's the roadmap look like there?
Well, I don't know. Soon is a difficult kind of thing to talk about. But there are some things that are on the roadmap for certain. Obviously, we have to add the other, so the north of 60 versions of the rule sets for Canada in the two different cycles. So that's on the roadmap. There's also a provision for team driving, which is slightly different than single drivers when it comes to sleeper burst splits. And the current version right now supports just the single drivers. So there'll be a team driver version that is coming out. That may be in 1903, which is the next release. Beyond that, for individual provinces, we're hesitant to go and make rule sets because we're not sure if they're going to harmonize or not. For example, Alberta has a vastly different rule set than Ontario. Ontario's is pretty much identical to the federal, but Alberta, it changes everything. Numbers are different. You can have a completely different rest style. It's vastly different. They might harmonize with the federal law. We don't know yet. So it's tough for us to take time to build that rule set when really we probably should focus on the north of 60 instead, because we know that one's not going to change because it's a federal one. So I can't comment on individual provinces yet, so I can only comment on what the roadmap looks like for the federal rules. So for the next release, we're hoping to have the team driver split, and then shortly after that, likely early next year, we'll have the next, which will be north of 60.
So for the yard move exemption, is that only for moving within a carrier's yard, or can it be used in any yard?
It again, same kind of definition, which is very loose. Essentially, if it's not a public road, then yard move is generally acceptable to use. But one thing is to note, in Canada, yard move still doesn't exist in the law, because that provision is part of the chunk of the law that's changing for 2021. So using yard move currently is actually not part of any of the Canadian laws. Most people still use it, and actually, even on paper, most drivers would not put themselves in the drive line if they were just moving around like a big Walmart parking lot and distribution center or something like that. But it's technically not part of the law. So the best thing to do on the question of when can I use it and what counts is to actually speak to that particular province that you're going to be driving in and to their enforcement partners. So if you're in Ontario, speak to the MTO before you start using it, just so that you know what they're expecting. That's the best advice I can give, because there's not really a definition of it in either US or Canada.
Right. So so basically it comes down to just reaching out to the province officials that govern that.
Yeah, that's the best option, simply because there's not a lot of definition, and the actual yard move provision is not in effect until 2021.
Okay. You'd spoken earlier about the Canadian short haul equivalent. Would you mind just revisiting that for a second and repeating what we know about that under 160 kilometers?
So if you're operating within 160 kilometers, it's essentially the same idea as the 100 air mile radius for the US. Is that as long as you're meeting the rest of the requirements, you don't need to log an hours of service log. So that still applies with ELD. So if you don't need to have a log because you're running under a short haul provision or any other exempt status, you still don't need an ELD. The ELD is not going to trump those current regulations. Those didn't change at all.
Great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Kyle, thank you so much for presenting today on Wildcard Wednesday.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.
I also just wanted to give a note here, because I've had the chance to communicate with many of you over the past 4 years that we've been doing this, and I've gotten to meet some of you in person, and that today's actually going to be my last Wildcard Wednesday. It's still going to continue, just taken over by someone else. We've done nearly 100 of these over the past 4 years, and appreciate all of your attendance and great questions, and as always, hope that you find these valuable. So thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate you taking some time out of your day, and have a great day, everyone.